First up is Joey Huddleston, who is an associate professor
Thank
in the
you.
School of
Yep.
Diplomacy. Congratulations, that's awesome. And so I'll give you like a 2-minute warning kind of thing, if that's okay. And yeah, so I'll turn the floor over to you, Joey.
Thank you. Just let me see if I can get this slide sharing thing going.
Okay.
Everyone sees that. Okay. And is it 5 or 7 minutes?
Oh, I could give you up to 10 since Ruth is here, but you know what? Let's do 7. That'll leave
Okay,
more time
I'll
for
shoot for
Q&A.
7. I should be able to keep to it. I have trimmed these slides down, but
Okay.
thank you everyone for seeing this working paper I have. It's called Who You Gonna Run To, and I'm trying to come up with a way to measure legitimacy in a conflict zone. Um, it's always a contested concept, even in my field of political science. It's this concept we use quite a lot, but it's very hard to put your finger on what exactly it means and how you would measure it. But using some really interesting survey data, I think I've come up with a way to kind of um, get close to kind of a measure of it. So I'm going to briefly show you just a small kind of sample of what's in this paper and what's in this survey. So there's really two research questions that I'm probing in this paper. One is, how does the contestation of legitimacy work? There's a lot of work uh, in conflict studies about how legitimacy building is part of contesting governance by Civil War actors. Um, and there's sort of a question of like, how does this contestation work on the ground by governance competitors, and then how are government outputs perceived by people on the ground and households? So who's credited if aid shows up in a conflict zone? Can we take it for granted that aid providers are the ones given credit? I sort of had two brief theories and hypotheses that I'm looking at in this paper as well. One is kind of intuitive, that the better that citizens perceive their security and services to be in a war zone, that the more legitimate they'll perceive governing actors, and that if there are security problems, that will hurt legitimacy, especially for disruptive actors. In this case, we're talking about the Houthi rebels in northern Yemen. So our data comes from a sample of 2,800 households from 6 sampling areas around the country. I won't get into all the ways we chose the sample because of how limited time is, but we have a pretty diverse sample from several different parts of the country. So we think we're getting a good sort of capture of citizens of Yemen. So let me talk about my independent variables that we're testing. So this survey questionnaire was about 30 questions long. All of them it took about an hour for households to take this survey. So it was a very in-depth conversation about perceptions of conflict, violence, disruption of daily life, insecurity, and sort of many of the things you might imagine would be important in a conflict zone. So I created 3 indices for independent variables. One was called the insecurity index. This is, you can see I've kind of grayed out the questions that are in that, but a question of how safe people feel, what they perceive the threats to be. Another measure on disruption: have they had to relocate? Are they displaced? Are they selling possessions to survive and feed themselves? How often are normal activities disrupted by conflict? And then questions about normal government services, such as how are the roads, how are the schools, how are the clinics, things like that. I have 3 indices for my independent variables. And then I selected a couple of the measures for legitimacy to show you, and I'm sort of ignoring the other ones that are in the paper. So the one I want to talk about today is conflict management. So we asked in-depth questions about if there are security issues or conflicts with neighbors, who do people go to for help managing local level conflict? sort of so we call it a behavioral measure of legitimacy. Who do I treat to be the government when you have several different groups claiming to be the government in the same area? So I want you to look at sort of three primary entities. We have the two main competitors in the Yemen conflict, the legitimate government, which is centered in Aden, and the Houthi authorities, the rebel group that many people might have heard about, which is centered in Sana'a, and then the local level governments, which are called governorates and local councils. So we're kind of probing, how do people think about the relationship between these three competing governments in this zone. So what you can see is that in general, people are claiming that they would go to their local level governments for this kind of aid. Although you can see in the, I don't know if I can do a laser pointer. Yeah, you can see here that there is a small percentage that is turning to the kind of higher level government. It's probably not surprising that this would be true for conflict management. Then we also have a second kind of measure of legitimacy, which is attitudes. So we have two questions that we're probing this. The one I'll talk about is this 5-point Likert scale measure with this question about who do you trust to improve the country's future as a nation? We heavily workshopped this question to kind of avoid sensitivity issues, did our best on that. So what you see is that the local governorates, councils and governorates are by far the most trusted. They kind of win across both the trust measures. So in the second row, you can see it's over 70% saying they have at least some trust. And then the recognized government in Aden is at about a little higher than 50%. And then the rebel government, the Houthis, have very little trust. And this, by the way, is in the part of the country that is controlled by the legitimate government, right? So it's not surprising that the rebels would be perceived very poorly. But even in the part of the country controlled by the Houthis, there's still quite a lot of distrust of them as a government, even though they do just about reach halfway, half support or trust on this measure. And even in that part, the recognized government still has a good amount of support, you can see here. Okay, two more things to show you on. So I'm going to show you the relationship between these variables. So what you're looking at here is an ordered logit test. So what this is basically what the bold-faced statistics are showing you is the likelihood of jumping to the next category up. Got 2 minutes, perfect. Next category up on this survey question. So you can see the chances of going from unlikely to neither, or from neither to likely on this question of how likely would you turn to each of these governments that are competing in Yemen. Okay, so what you see is households that have a higher score on the insecurity index are less likely to turn to the Houthi authorities, the rebels, more likely to turn to the legitimate government, and more likely to turn to governorates, local councils, and militias. So basically, the rebel group is losing out the more they disrupt, the more the conflict disrupts people's lives, the less people say, I would turn to this group, even if they're in charge. The disruption and service quality indices tell a sort of similar story, except we have a flipping on the between the legitimate government and the Houthi authorities. So if services are good, the rebels are credited for that. And if the recognized government is not credited, it's less likely to be credited for that. And of course, militias are never credited for that. When policing is poor, we have this one question about whether people perceive policing to be good or poor. When policing is poor, sort of everyone is blamed across the board for that being a problem. But if it's good, only the local governments receive credit for that. Okay, and then, okay, so the other thing I'll show you is this is OLS model, so not a logit, it's a regular regression, looking at the relationship between the same independent variables and people's reported trust. So what I want you to notice here is this is the same measure I showed you, conflict management choices. If people say they're likely to turn to the Houthis for conflict management, then they're less likely to trust them. Oh, wait a minute. I think I said that wrong. Basically, we see is a sort of regular. Sorry, I flipped that around. People say it's unlikely they would turn to an authority for conflict management. They also claim to trust them less, and this is across all measures here. So when they say it's unlikely, we have negative coefficients. And when they say it's likely I would turn to them, we have positive coefficients. So this trust measure, here's my point. The trust measure, the behavioral measure of legitimacy, and the attitudinal measure of legitimacy tell us the same story. They're going in the same direction, which is kind of a validity test for this attempt to measure legitimacy in this conflict. So basic findings here, the sort of takeaway point that would be in the paper would be that if you're a rebel group causing chaos in a country, when things go wrong, you're blamed for that. The Houthis are blamed for the bad, but they're also credited for things that go well in those zones, seen through the sort of service provision. The recognized government is kind of not blamed for the bad or credited for the good. And it seems that what our data shows is it's because local governments are credited when things are going well in that part of the country. And then finally, these two different kinds of measures of legitimacy are telling us the same story, right? So we're seeing reliance on governorates for conflict, school, and aid. All of these predict higher trust. And I take it to be sort of proof of concept for this idea of empirical, what I'm calling empirical legitimacy, meaning rather than just talking about this as an abstract concept, rooting it in some hard questions we can ask people in these zones. I'll leave it there and look forward to some questions. Hopefully we'll see if we get any of those. And I don't know.
Thank you, Joey. That was fascinating and an interesting perspective on a conflict that I've seen and heard about, but didn't know too much about. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any question that they would like to ask Joey, or if you want to save your questions for the end, that's good too. All right.
Either way.
Okay, yeah. Great. Thanks, Joey. So I think I will then turn it over to Nancy Inella. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Nancy?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great. And you are a faculty member at the College of Nursing.
I am. Mm-hmm.
So I will turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about my research. So I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint here.
While you're doing that, I'll just let you know, I'll give you a 2-minute warning when you are close. Okay.
Oh, that's okay. I did something very brief. So basically, I had quite a few initiatives going on the year that I received the, and this was last year, the Researcher of the Year award. So I'm very grateful for that. But I had a lot of really big research initiatives going on, most of them actually including students, because my passion is to get students involved in research early on so they enjoy it, they're not scared of it, and it becomes, second nature for them, especially in nursing, being able to question what they see and work toward better outcomes. So one of the things that I noticed was an issue is the education of end-of-life care. I teach in gerontological nursing, but I also teach in pediatric nursing courses. And I always found that end-of-life care was an area that really scared students. So as a background, in general, research shows that healthcare students feel less confident when caring for patients at the end of life following graduation and entry into practice. So with that information and seeing that students sometimes scored lower on, the nursing boards and other types of testing when it came to asking questions about end of life, I actually partnered with Dr. Brian Pilkington, who now works with the Hackensack School of Medicine, and we did a comprehensive literature review, and we created end-of-life scenarios for students, and we really based them off of ethical dilemmas focused around autonomy and dignity. So we carried this out first in the gerontological nursing course. They participated in end-of-life ethical dilemmas with different scenarios in older adults, and we really focused again on things like autonomy and dignity and how that impacted their nursing care of these individuals. So then using an OMIC grant, students from nursing and also a pre-med biology student we worked with together to create a 30-minute video, which included a talk by myself, Dr. Pilkington, and even a acted out case study by the students. And then this video was presented in the pediatric nursing courses and actually other healthcare courses that students took in various disciplines. They were given a pre-test. They watched the video, they participated in an ethical debate at the end of that, and then they were given a post-test. And the result of these was basically there was a statistically significant increase in confidence related to caring for pediatric patients. So they did state that they felt more confident, more of a self-efficacy. We actually used a self-efficacy scale to look at that. And then we also asked them their ability to rate that they felt they were able to define autonomy and dignity prior to the session and then after the session. Interestingly, both increased, but dignity actually increased higher after those sessions. So that was one of the first studies. That information was actually presented at Petersheim last year by the students. And it was also a poster presentation at the Gamma Nu Rankemeyer Research Day for Nursing. Then another study that was involved in too that I also brought nursing students in was with speech language pathology faculty and students that looked at parental feeding practices and education and the impact on nutritional status of the children with cerebral palsy and feeding disorder. We specifically looked at parents of children that were diagnosed with cerebral palsy and had some sort of feeding issue associated with that. We interviewed these parents and we found after the qualitative interviewing that they definitely demonstrated a need for further, education and direction on how to feed their children. They actually felt quite scared in trying to feed their children and that they weren't given enough information, prior to their child coming home or prior to having to feed them on their own. So many of these children, would go into school settings during the day and the parents would learn that they were advancing their diet, trying to get them more on solid foods, and the parents themselves hadn't even realized that, and they still had them maybe on formula. So they really felt there was this educational gap there. And now we're trying to look at what sort of interventions we can use and create to develop better education for these families. So these results were presented last spring at the New Jersey Speech Language Hearing Association that had a conference in Long Branch. And again, the nursing students working with the speech language pathology students presented that. Some of the future directions and what I'm working on now actually include, in the nursing research class that I teach, I've had some senior and junior nursing students reach out to me about noticing some of their patients in the inpatient hospital setting struggling with getting enough sleep. So I've been working with them to do an integrative review of literature related to interventions out there that have shown to be effective in promoting sleep in hospital patients. And they want to bring that forward and do some pilot studies in their clinical settings that they're working in. And I myself have always looked at maternal feeding practices. That's why, extending that to patients with cerebral palsy, but also in children in various populations that are preschool age, because I feel like if we can attack looking at some of these feeding practices earlier on, we can actually look at child weight status and make an impact on that. So my research in the past has always been looking at maternal feeding practices in preschool and their impact on preschool obesogenic behaviors. But now I've extending it into actually interventional things within the community. So in particular, working at community preschools to have some interventional studies, being able to do some of those moving forward and make an impact on children's weight status. Even if their weight status is not high, they may show obesogenic behaviors, meaning that they eat high calorie, dense foods and also have sedentary behaviors. So even if it hasn't impacted their weight yet, they still have these behaviors, which may lead to higher weight later in their life. So thank you for the opportunity to present this. I tried to keep to 5 minutes or under, so that way I know we have a lot of people in an hour. Any questions?
My apologies. I was talking to you and my microphone was off. Oh, Teams, just love Teams. Anyway, my question for you is what challenges have you faced with working with student researchers? Because I would like to do more of that, but
Yeah.
I'm a little leery about it.
So I've found that you really have to make sure the students are motivated and that they want to do it. I've been really lucky. I offer it. Not every student, I always tell my students at the beginning of the semester, if anybody's interested in research, reach out to me because I have some things going on. I know other professors working on things too, but you really do have to screen. Students are busy. Sometimes they can't make the commitment. I think being clear and telling them what they're doing as part of the research. So if they're going to help with data collection, like the students that helped with the qualitative interviewing, we actually did like a divide and conquer. Myself, Dr. Neubauer was working with me. We made sure we were always there on those interviews on Teams, but we also had students participate and they had like a sign-up genius of who was available on what evenings to help with these. So I think if you're clear in your expectations, you give them timelines and the students are highly motivated, and you can kind of get that when you meet with them and talk to them. You can really get them passionate about research, and there's a lot they can do. Certainly data collection, even data analysis. Again, they're always working with us and, kind of seeing what we're doing. So it's more like us doing it and showing them in the undergrad level. But it's great, I think, to start now, because certainly we want them to move on to graduate programs and even doing their own research. So data collection, again, with the oversight of the faculty, works really well, especially if you have motivated students that have come to you and expressed this interest, and you're clear in what you would expect of them.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
So now I'd like to introduce Fanti Ji. I'm sure I said that. Fan Li Ji, sorry. Would you pronounce your name properly for me?
Fan Li Jia.
Fan Li
Like
Jia.
Ja,
Sorry,
yeah, like Ja
sorry.
Rule, so like the rapper, or Ja.
Okay, well, thank you. He is a professor of psychology, and I will turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
All right. So can everybody see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right. So, right. And thanks everyone. And this is the, I try to put in 3-4 studies into the package within 5 to 10 minutes, see how it goes. So the project's about intergenerational transmissions, about environmental behavior. So and then this is the collaborative work with my visiting scholar from China. She was here 2022, 2023, and then we got a chance to collect the data in China. All right, to start with, so just basic questions, like I just want to figure out, so who are the primary social agent to teach young children about the environment? Right, the question should be really simple. Parents. Right, and from my past studies, so we did an interview and we find out that, so like child learn from parents, and then more likely from this family tradition. So this is a quote from interview from a participant. He or she said, I came from a family who has farming in our backyard as a kid, right? So we kind of grew up learning how to plant a garden and care for the garden. So those were just the values that instilled in me when I was young. Grow up now, there's things have taken us adult. Grow now, my own family kind of encouraging those same things. So like this environmental values, protect environment, climate change, it's basically from generation to a generation. And that makes me think how and if a parent's behavior, so environmental behavior, can be transmitted to children. So those behavior are independent. So it's not like I tell my child, so go turn off the lights, right? And then the child follow right after. So both of the parents and child fill up survey independently. And yeah, so as we expected, some of the behavior transmitted directly, and surprisingly, some didn't. Especially, we look at children reuse the paper, so that's all based on survey, and then how children save energy. Right, and we look at how, and then what are the mechanisms between the two behavior. So first, we have to look at like the child has to perceive their parents' behavior. So we call perceived parental action. So ask how often does the father, mother recycle or doing their behavior. They have to be directly seen. And then it's also depending on the communications. So we ask the child, like how often does their parents talk about the benefit of the environmental behaviors? And then most importantly, we design a survey based on the interview, and then we look at how parent-child direct engagement. It's not like parents doing behavior by themselves, right? This is how like parents interact with the child. Like how often have the child have the parents involved in daily activity? We have like 18 activities, and then we using measurement design, we narrow down on 9 activities. So overall, parents' behavior do transmit to child, and then that depending on their perceived action, their direct communication, and then direct engagement. Right. So that's kind of like early work, set of the foundations. And I got this idea from my son. So one day, but back at the time he was 4 years old, and we bought him the toy. Right, and then once he opened the toy, right, and it said, like, "Hey, throw the box into the garbage can," and then he responded saying that, "Hey, this is not garbage. This is recycle." And I was surprised, like 4 years old, like what, right? And then this is making me think the intergenerational transmission is not like one way; it should be both way. Right, it makes sense if you think about child growing older, saying that, "Hey, daddy, the organic food make me healthy, make me taller, so buy organic food." Right, so the parents' child behavior definitely influence parents. So we look at this quite a complicated called actor-partner independence model. Just basically look at how parent-child influencing each other, right? And then we look at a knowledge base. So we see a children's environmental knowledge to see if their knowledge predicts parents' behavior, and which it does, right? So the children's environmental knowledge possibly predict parents' behaviors. For example, buying organic food, bringing old shopping bag, saving energy, water. So those are kind of reverse transmitted. And then this is something unique and interesting. We assume parents' knowledge should also predict children's behavior, because parents' knowledge. I know more about climate change. I'm more aware of that, so it should also influence my child's behavior. But this direct path was not significant. So parents' knowledge did not directly transmit it to children's behavior. So that may impact or show that knowledge behavior gap. So there's something should be in between. And unfortunately, we didn't ask things in between, like actions, communication, direct engagement. So we believe that should be also within. Or there's other factors like family or parent-child relationships, and then the interaction. Right. So overall, there should be both reciprocal. And then the third piece of the study is what else? Right. So we look at parents. But then the children, they go to school, right? So they should learn. My son go to watch YouTube, not every day, and then play iPad, right? So there should be all different sources. So we look at it. This is 4 fifth graders. So all samples 4 fifth graders, and their parents. So this is based on their the children's data. So we look at it just basically is just kind of what are the sources, and then they just check yes or no on variety of sources, right? And then this is a school. 74% of the child checked the school, and then 67% child checked the books, internet. So the 3 are the primary agent, but not parents, because we expect the parents should be. I'm not saying 100%, but should be like 80%. But parents only like 52. So 52% checked yes, and then did a 48 check no. Right, and then other sources, TV, peers is kind of low, newspapers. The reason why we have newspaper because in the following, so I can explain like why newspaper, because nobody read newspaper nowadays. Right, and another interesting part is we also look at this logic index, which is the city accessibility index, which all children cross from 13 different cities. And then some of the cities are highly green So green including high GDPs, high low pollutions, high air qualities, and then those type of stuff. And then there's just a few 381 children from low logic, low sustainability green cities. And then we found very interesting patterns as from low logic city, low sustainability city, so children receive less resources, so like or less opportunities for them to learn, right? Except this newspaper. So if we look at the discrepancy between those two, and then they are quite less large as before, as previous, like 45 say yes in the low, and then 54% say yes. So discrepancy is less than 10%. So this make me think probably in low green cities, so newspaper is just another source for the child, right? Or we have a newspaper and flyer, so we had both, right? And then we also have adult sample, which we didn't include in this study. Right? So there's a couple of future project or ongoing project I'm doing, right? So now we know the quantitative way, so parents' behavior transmitted to child depending on a whole bunch of stuff. But I want to look at what exactly parents taught the child, right? So what are the content? They tell recycling, climate change, protect the environment, in what way? So we had an interview data, so we haven't analyzed them yet. So basically we asked the parents, so describe a time, right? So you know how you teach about child, right? And then we have analyzed that. And then also intergenerational transmission is not about parents, child per se, but also grandparents, right? So we also have a story, but it's a more retrospectively talk about grandparents, right? Basically ask how the person learned from their grandparents, and then we can analyze the story. And then lastly, I'm also working on a data set we collect 10 years ago, not me, but part of me, and then my advisors team who was retired. We also look at environmental activism because this is more sensitive, hot topic. So we want to look at what are the characteristics or personalities, and then we ask them what is their crystal moment. So why and how and when they become an environmental activist, right? So those are being rolled, right? And then lastly, I want to briefly talk about this large, I call it mega studies I participate. The PIs from NYU. We look at so 250 of us get together. So we start to look at all the interventions, and then the expert, all of us rate and then select the interventions we thought performed the best. So we got 11 interventions, and then we want to look at how those interventions perform on this belief climate change, climate policy support, willing to share the climate information, and then planting trees. Right, and then I'm not going to go into any details of those 11 interventions, but one of them related to that intergenerational transmission. Is the researcher asked, just write a letter for the future generations, right? So ask them to write letters. So socially close child who's raised in 25 years when they were adult, and then describe the current action toward ensuring habit planet. And this intervention show quite consistent across all the dependent variables, except planting trees. Right, and then kind of like over other intervention, right? And yeah, so that's kind of like a multiple study packed into that. And then this is my lab. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. That was very interesting. I know you've already got a very packed research agenda, but as a parent of older teenagers, I would love to see you replicate that study with, like late high schoolers, because the dynamic between parent and child changes quite a bit in that stage of child development. And yeah, I would love to see a study like that. That'd be very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, looking at the table where you showed the two different kinds of cities, how do you kind of think about the way that city level resources translate into family level effects? Just quickly, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
This is more about resources, opportunity, and education. So like education, I think that's the key because we look at environmental education, the paper published environmental education research, and we look at how they receive like a big large of the index talk about how like the school level, like a good school versus perform worsely academically. So that's interesting one. And then also we look at just basically like the individual like incomes, right? And then the high growing city people, parents tend to have a higher income, better education. So I think those city factors really translate into individual factors, and then really translate to a family. And then also, if you look at in one of the index, they talk about the green zone in the city. You know, like the low logic accessibility city. It can be large. So one of the cities is from where I'm from, like north. This is a Chinese data from northeastern China. They are like while economically while GDP while, but then it's heavily polluted because I don't know what China's government put all the heavy industry there in the northwest and northeast. So they have the city may have less green space and then more factory, and then that's maybe family or perspective how the family gonna take the child to national parks. They have to go to south a little bit to see those. So I think this really translate in different dynamic. In short, thank you.
Donovan?
I just wanted to point out an interesting pattern among both of your papers, Joey and Tuan-Li. And I say this as someone without any expertise at all, just to the top level thing of this sort of impact of the local or the interest of the local. This is very broad strokes, but after Joey's paper about sort of turning to and trusting and absorbing legitimacy from a local environment, how that translates to a degree about environmental education that you're talking about, Tuan-Li. So again, very different in the details, but just like an aerial photograph of both of your papers kind of yields that. So really interesting.
Genevieve?
And I would like to, in looking at your work, you really focus on the knowledge component of the translation. I wonder, as you're moving forward, are you considering looking more at the application, the behavior? So it might be one thing to have higher knowledge and be able to communicate that knowledge or information about content to your children, but how do your actions demonstrate that? And are actions more valuable or as valuable as knowledge translation? So I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. I kind of wrote that in one of the paper they call action more than word. So it just like so like one of the early study I showed the child must be directly observed. It's not like I do whatever good, right? And then my child can duplicate because there's something gap, right? So the child must be directly observed, and then the parents must be directly interact. So like one of the question survey I had is just they play together, raising up a planet or raising up an animal. And then there's another one, the parents need to take a child to national park, to go museum, not only see things for fun, but also learning stuff. So just like action is the key.
Yeah, and I think also, and to get what Elizabeth said as well, is to ferment that action, translation, to be that knowledge broker, right? You need replication and replication over the child's development. And so is it just once or twice, or is it hitting the child, engaging with the child multiple times, I should say, on this experience and really cementing it into who they are then, as opposed to just a one and done, more of a scaffolding.
Right, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, fascinating work. Thank you for sharing it. Any other questions? All right, then I will introduce Donovan Sherman, who is a professor of English, and I will turn the floor over to you, Donovan.
Thanks so much. And I take it we all have the power of presenting. So
you should. Mary,
I'm sure I do. Just give me a moment here.
Yeah. Mary assured me that she would set it all up.
No, yes, I wouldn't doubt her for a moment.
Yeah.
So I'm going to sort of go with a nice little clip here and maybe selectively just dip into some ideas here. But my project, broadly speaking, is really invested in the burgeoning subfield in my area of expertise, which is early modern or Renaissance literature. There's a subfield within that study that is really looking at, and questioning and rethinking what race means at that time. It was a kind of common received wisdom for a long time that race as we know it today almost didn't really necessarily exist at that time. And what a lot of scholars have been showing is that in fact it did. And while it might be historically contingent in some ways, we cannot speak of the Renaissance or the early modern era as if it was solely without or devoid of our contemporary conceptions of race. Within that subfield, my project is looking at specifically some plays of Shakespeare's. I'm a Shakespearean by training, and plays of his that are staged or set in what we might call a classical era, classical Rome, classical Greece, or that engage to some degree with classical concepts. So the case study I want to give you today is from his play, The Comedy of Errors. The Comedy of Errors is an early play of Shakespeare's, and it's very funny and it's very silly. And it's filled with, it's based off of an old play, in fact, by Plautus, who was a Roman comedian and dramatist. In any case, I am looking at this play, and what fascinates me about it is that it, more than any other play of Shakespeare's, it involves mentioning terms such as slave or bondage, you know, synonyms of bondsman. And there is slavery in this play. In fact, it involves just a really quick summation of a very complicated play. It involves a family that is split apart in a shipwreck. This all happens before the play begins. Two twins are split apart, and each of their respective servants or slaves go with them. And one set finds themselves in Syracuse, and one set finds themselves in Ephesus. These are both ancient Mediterranean cities. Syracuse, you might know. Ephesus is now present-day Turkey. In any case, when one looks up what slave necessarily meant, or bondman, you'll see, I'm drawing here from both the Oxford English Dictionary and an entry for slave in a dictionary in Shakespeare's day. Slave for punishment, bearing a fork or gallows through the city with his hands tied unto it, a knave, a villain. So slave meant, you know, one who was humiliated, one who was villain. There actually refers to where we get the term villain, which is from a notion of slavery or villainy or bondage. Hold on a second. There we go. This is, as I said before, pre-modern critical race studies. I'm not going to read this entire definition here, but when I started to rethink, like, okay, what is it about this play that draws me to it? How can we think about race in a play that is primarily, we might think of it as, you know, Greek people in hundreds of years ago, in a play that is set hundreds of years before that? What does that have to do with race, right? But drawing from this, again, this field of pre-modern critical race studies and its attendant sort of shorthand of race before race. If you search for this on Twitter, hashtag race before race, you'll find a lot of fascinating work that's being done here by scholars on questions of race. In fact, now there's an entire center of race before race at Arizona State. When I was sort of dipping into this work on the Comedy of Errors, I knew there's evidence that Shakespeare was drawing from the letter to Ephesians from, you know, St. Paul's epistles. And this is a translation that he would be looking at in order perhaps to get this repeated usage of slaves and mentioning slaves, in which there's a speech about servants. Servants, be obedient to them who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ. And there's marginalia at the bottom in the Geneva Bible edition that Shakespeare would have read that says, which have dominion over your bodies, but not over ye souls. And this is after the marginalia, servants, be obedient to your masters. Okay, so what I'm establishing now is there's a groundwork of Shakespeare's sources in which he is interested in questions of slavery, right? We also have a kind of origin story that is completely false, but that at the time, Shakespeare and his contemporaries believed that what they would call Ethiopians, that was actually more of a kind of broad term, but the people of the southern hemisphere had darker skin because they were descendants of Ham. This comes from the story in Genesis of the curse of Ham, who saw Noah, his father, naked while Noah was drunk. And here we have another gloss from the Bible that Shakespeare would have looked at, saying that his younger son Ham is cursed. I'm sorry, that should say cursed, not cured. cursed is written as a most vile slave. So slave keeps coming up. Another origin story for perhaps the kind of darkening, darker skin of different people that again is a complete fabrication, but that people in Shakespeare's time believed, was that it was from an ancient myth of Ovid's, who was a classical writer. You might know Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a translation he would have read. The story was of Phaeton, the person who drew the sun in a chariot across the sky, and how one day his son took over and tried to draw the chariot and in fact fell, and the sun fell down in the southern part of the hemisphere and people became sort of dark. Okay, so again, total racist mythologies, but important ones to understand how race was sort of thought of at his time. And as you can see, I'm kind of building this bridge between bondage and slavery. So when we go back to the original source of the play that Shakespeare was drawing from, which again I mentioned is by Plautus, it was a play called The Brothers Menaechmus. Those plays themselves would have been performed, and this is a great classicist, Daniel Padilla Peralta, who's at Princeton, wrote about the audiences that those initially would have had, which would have been to slaves in Plautus's time, right? So the plays are actually filled with little cheeky references to slaves who might be in the audience who would understand the references and the drama that was unfolding in the plays themselves. Another major inspiration for me is this notion of the Black Atlantic. Of course, I'm talking about the Mediterranean, and this is a really paradigmatic book by a scholar named Paul Gilroy, who wanted to rethink about the Atlantic as a zone of race, of the sort of creation and fabrication of race. Partially what I want to do is drag that back to Shakespeare's time, look at the Mediterranean, which at the time of Shakespeare's writing would have been heavily trafficked in slavery. England did not itself have slaves, but it profited from the slave trade and having, thank you, 2 minutes, incorporated companies that would engage in the slave trade, right? Okay, this is where it all comes together for me. And this is my aha moment in my research. I started looking up production histories of the Comedy of Errors and found, I'm going to show you one example here, there are many others I could talk about in the Q&A, in which the slave characters, even though at the time this does not necessarily track with the history, the slave characters in this play are over and over and over again cast with actors of color, as if there's something in our cultural unconscious that recognizes a link between the slavery of Shakespeare's day and our contemporary conceptions of race. That was the spark for me to go back and say, okay, is there a way that these modes of enslavement in Shakespeare's plays, even though they are historically anachronistic, can be read as a site of the creation of race, or at least in dialogue with our understanding of race. And so I'm going to skip here a little bit. Here's some more source work. Here's just a couple photos that I think maybe I'll end with, which is more examples of the kind of, these are all productions of the Comedy of Errors in which these characters are cast. On the left, you can see a kind of Orientalist stereotype of Middle Eastern, brown, quote unquote, other. And then on the right, a kind of contemporary, coded as a kind of urban person of color, same characters in the play, right? And I can maybe go over these later, but I have some actual quotes from the play in which over and over again they reference the beating, the repeated beating of these slaves on stage. When that occurs with actors of color in an American context, it can't help but evoke the kind of legacy of American slavery. And that in turn helps me read back and think about what are the connections between slavery and race in this play and in Shakespeare's Mediterranean. Thanks a lot.
Wow, that was a lot to think about.
I know I packed a lot in there. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it was fascinating because I have a season subscription to the Shakespeare Festival at Drew, and have for more years than I want to count. And
Sure.
Yeah, you made me think about the casting and about the slavery references and also how language evolves through the years and yet still has influence over the way we think about things. It's fascinating. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, that make me like the comedy also make me think about one of the I went to a conference and I saw there's not a conference, like I went to my schools, my child's school, And then there's a Cat in the Hat. I don't remember the authors. Dr. Seuss.
Dr. Seuss,
Dr.
yeah.
Seuss, yeah.
And then there was a book had a very stereotypical Chinese scary face, like the old Asian, like I don't know, mustache, something.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I don't know, I don't feel comfortable because it's all
Absolutely.
okay. I don't have that. But
You know,
that was in the children's book.
Dr. Seuss has been accused of racism in many different contexts. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Okay,
that so the Cat in the Hat, also that character, I think there's pretty clear evidence that Dr. Seuss drew from minstrelsy, which is the practice of blackface, of white actors putting on blackface to act as if they were sort of comical, exaggerated versions. So the kind of the cane and the top hat and the kind of mischievous character. You know, I mean, Dr. Seuss also has books where he was living at a time in which it was official U.S. policy to intern Asian Americans, right? And so and Japanese Americans, and so he's a reflection of that ideology, which by no means excuses it. At the same time, some of his books have a message that sort of you know, almost kind of hippie-ish kind of message that kind of resonates as sort of like we're all the same, you know. So it's a weird mixture of platitudes, and we still see it today. So and we still see it in Shakespeare. That production I referenced of The Comedy of Errors, I went down to the archives and saw a film of it. It was from 14 years ago. Oh no, excuse me, 20 years ago. And it's filled with just these like the music is like the most stereotypical like Middle Eastern music, and there's hookahs and belly dancing, and it's just right out of a kind of Western fantasy of what the Middle East is, you know. And that was 2005, and so that it was not that long ago that was a sort of acceptable thing to do, you know.
It'd be interesting to have a collective, you know, something put all together to see what has been done, what are the stereotypes. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, that's partially what I'm
through
working
that,
on.
yeah.
I'll just say really quickly that there was a great production of it in the Oregon Shakespeare Festival with an all-black cast where it's set in Harlem, and the conceit is that the shipwreck that happens is that separates them is similar to slavery, and now black families are trying to find each other now, and it sort of resonates. So that's a way to kind of reclaim it and make it, I think, more interesting.
Wow.
you.
That sounds like a great production. I would have liked to have seen that. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right, thank you so much, Donovan. And our last but certainly not least presenter is Genevieve Zip, who is the professor of interprofessional health sciences. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Zip.
And thank you very much. I'm delighted to share my work with you today. And I'm going to put it on slideshow. And so I took a slightly different approach. I think I tried to give a little overview of my work over the last year and really my perspective in terms of research. And so my greatest passion is to engage in what I call a team science approach. And so you'll see as I share some of the work that I've been dealing with over the last year or so, that everything is in collaboration. And so with that, my initial work many years ago started investigating the concept of using mind maps in education. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with mind maps, it's similar to concept mapping, but with more of a pictorial representation as opposed to more of a word representation. And you're really thinking in 360 as opposed to a more linear perspective. And as a young educator, I found mind mapping extremely helpful for me to help my students with their ability to critically think about concepts. But more importantly, it helped me to explain to my dean my line of research, because at the time and still to today, my line of research was very varied. And so when he kept looking at my work, he would say, oh, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're doing that. I don't see the connections. You need to have one line of research. And I tried to use the mind map to help him to see that my lines were all connected. And the main theme that they were all connected with was one in terms of this team science approach. So my work has focused on interprofessional education, critical thinking, virtual reality, and readiness. And that is my area in my educational perspective. As a physical therapist, I do have work that I do that focuses more on motor control and motor learning, but I won't share that today. So I'm going to give you a little speed through. When I talk about critical thinking, over the last year, we've just, it's in press, and we've just published, or will be published, a manuscript on creating a blueprint for doctoral programs to develop critical thinking. We all know that in our programs, and my house, where I sit at Seton Hall, is in the PhD in health science, and of course we'll have objectives to demonstrate that our students will advance in their critical thinking. But how do we ensure that occurs? How do we develop that? And so we evaluated our program. We looked at the different competencies within our program, and we forged ahead and put together a blueprint that will be coming out for assessing critical thinking in doctoral students. And from that work, we also recognized that with critical thinking, really what is occurring there is we want our students at the doctoral level, because it's a health science program, they're not all from the same discipline. We want them to engage in exchanging ideas across professions. And so we really focus on this notion of interprofessional education. And while we're not necessarily investigating it at the PhD level, I am investigating it at the graduate level with our health professional programs, because the other hat that I wear in our school is the director for our Center of Interprofessional Education. And so I've collaborated with colleagues, that a graduate student who was part of the PhD and has moved on and is doing work in where he is located now. And I've continued to collaborate with him on interprofessional education and really seeking to understand the attitudes of not only the students, but what we call the clinical preceptors, those individuals who are taking our students and extending the academic curriculum into their clinical worlds, and to understand what they understand about interprofessional education. And then I've also I've collaborated with an association of health professionals, allied health professionals, and we're focusing on recognizing that interprofessional education needs to be more than just the professionals. It has to be all of the stakeholders. And so we've created an innovative model that we've used to educate all individuals on the importance of stakeholders coming together in healthcare to advance this interprofessional perspective. And from there, we recognize that, well, it's really great to have an awareness, right? A global knowledge of, the ability to critically think and also to integrate into interprofessional education. But how are we really preparing ourselves as faculty and our students to be ready to practice? And so now I have a line of research also concurrently that's going on that's looking at the readiness theory as my guiding lens. And one of the studies that we've just, we've published recently is on readiness to teach online. And we focused on that given, our transition to more of an online program with COVID, and our transition to an online program with the PhD specifically. And we're trying to really help understand that readiness is not only about one's knowledge, but also one's perception of the importance of the information. So their attitude towards it and their confidence, their ability to then confidently execute it. And that taken together enables that perception of readiness. So we're doing work on that area. We've published a couple of articles on that, and I just put one here that was just recently done. And as we continue to talk about this notion of interprofessional education, critical thinking, okay, and readiness, we've come to realize that, we use lots of different tools to promote readiness in our students. And again, we're now looking to understand how we can best use artificial intelligence. And so we are currently in the development with the Association of Doctoral Programs in Health Sciences, creating a position statement that will guide doctoral programs in health sciences in terms of how to best integrate artificial intelligence into their doctoral programs, but for advancing critical thinking in their students. And so that's some work that we're moving on. The one that I wanted to focus on today really is, very briefly, is one that sits within our Center of Interprofessional Education. And for those of you who might not know, we have a center that provides all of our health profession students in the School of Health and Medical Science with what we call an IPE journey of professional transformation. And we have these modules that the students do asynchronously and synchronously online over a 2-year period. And over the years, there have been lots of paper and pencil activities within there. We've always assessed pre-post their change in knowledge base. And as this virtual world has come upon us, we've decided that we wanted to infuse virtual world learning into each of these modules. And so right now we have 3 different experiences over the 2 years within these modules. The first one is this emergency preparedness. The next one is this focus on concussion and psychological well-being. And the last one is delivering unexpected news. All of them are using the virtual world, and they're all using avatars to provide the students with a more realistic idea of how to engage with patients before they actually get into the clinic. And so these are just examples of what we're doing. And so we, of course, take pre and post assessments about their knowledge. We take pre and post assessments in all of these modules about how they perceive the medium of the virtual reality. And ultimately, we found that yes, this is a very low stakes because they're not dealing with real patients, so they feel more comfortable, but it's approaching a realism, so it really prepares them, they believe, better. It helps them in their readiness, and they can go back and do it multiple times, so they feel that repetitiveness of it is really helpful. And so now what we are doing this summer is we're looking at the different types of delivery of these avatars, one with a live actor, which really gives different benefits to the interaction, and a non-live actor, an AI actor. And so I have I put in here so I can send this out to you guys, and you could click on the links and you can actually see the different modes of delivery. And we're looking to see student and faculty preferences and the differences that they perceive in readiness, and ultimately to validate the modalities in terms of accuracy and communication authenticity. And so that's where I'm kind of putting my work together. Okay. And so I just end with that my path always to truth may be rocky because I like collaborations, but ultimately engaging in that team science approach to research I find is really rewarding for myself and my colleagues.